Shalom and welcome. My name is Dina Schoenfeld, Director of Programming for the Jewish Community Alliance of Southern Maine. We're so pleased to present tonight's special program, Under Dust and Shards, My Breath, Abraham Sutzkever's poetry of resistance, renewal, and wonder, in honor of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, today, January 27th, the date the Soviet Army liberated Auschwitz in 1945. This program is dedicated to Lee Sharkey of blessed memory and presented as part of the JCA's annual Arts and Culture series, made possible with support from community members like you. In addition to tonight's presentation, join us for our Black History Month free film streaming with the Maine Jewish Film Festival of the documentary Shared Legacies, the African American Jewish Civil Rights Alliance over the weekend of February 4th through 6th, and for a virtual book talk with author Rachel Sarati discussing We Share the Same Sky, a memoir of memory and migration on February 10th, exploring her grandmother's experience of the Holocaust. To learn more, please visit the JCA's website, mainjewish.org. A few housekeeping notes. This program is being recorded. Please keep yourselves muted during the program. Following the presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions and comments. Please type your questions into the Zoom chat box and we will read them aloud. About our presenters. Mark Melnicove is a poet, essayist, and educator. He has worked as executive director of the Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance, editor-in-chief of Tilbury House Publishers, and English teacher at Falmouth High School. Mark's archival papers are housed at Bowdoin College. Over 50 of his relatives perished in the Holocaust. Anna Wrobel is an historian, teacher, poet, and child of refugees from Poland, a partisan mother and Soviet soldier father. Her poems and essays exist in journals and poetry collections. She has presented at the Holocaust and Human Rights Center, Puffin Foundation, Maine Jewish Museum, the Maine Conference for Jewish Life, the Jewish Community Alliance, and USM's Ali Sage Lectures. Her Shoah poetry has been used in numerous classrooms. Welcome, Anna and Mark.
I would like to begin with dedication. Mark and I are going to begin with a dedication to Lee Sharkey of blessed memory. I'm reading from a much abbreviated essay regarding Lee Sharkey's most Vilnius-related collection, Walking Backwards, Tupelo Press, 2016. I found a fruitful world because my ancestors planted it for me. Likewise, I am planting for my children. From the Talmud. Lee Sharkey explores cultural forces bridging present to past and back again. How will we as ancestors bridge to our children's children and they to us? Lee's poetry is a call to the loving mission of planting for the children. If one delves into footnotes and references from Beckett to the Torah, a vast knowledge opens. Lee is at once teacher and sublime and poet of sublime illumination, telling truths grand and small, while planting the reader in direct feelings, inchoate yearnings, and unflinching observations. The cover art of Walking Backwards depicts post-pogrom deported Jews. Not knowing where they go, sad and broken people walk one foot in front of the other, while Lee places one foot behind the other until they meet in their shared exile and wandering. The poem, in the capital of a small republic, lays bare how carefully one must tread when walking backwards. Lowering my right foot cautiously, lowering my left foot cautiously. The stones are what knowledge I have to go on down the 7 stinking streets of this plague. The poet engages in a brave task, reversing time, seeking out moments that might be undone. Walking Backwards is about reunion, dialogue, a Hasidic tale repairing the world's torn fabric, the restoration of human covenants, an Einsteinian walk along the space-time continuum of history. To reach the ancestors, Lee walks backwards through the Shoah, pre-war Vilnius, urban migration, pogroms and exiles, medieval treks to Jerusalem, backwards to the crossings of Hebrews into ancient and modern Israel. Walking Backwards is poetic Kabbalah, mysteries of histories hidden between lines. Poems interact with mystic spirits Lee has long traveled with. Paul Celan, Nellie Sachs, Abraham Sutzkever, survivors of the Shoah. Markish Peretz, a victim of Stalin's Night of the Murdered Poets. Their works radiate loss, sorrow, and great longing for life in full bloom. From the poem Ground Truthing, we discern Lee's path and a message. I was bent on knowledge of the flowering branch, the wind that sweeps the sea in its path. It has come to this, rod in hand of one who speaks with scarred mouth. Storm on the mountain and arduous God, but this gift each morning, to everyone his portion that opens the matrix, the fruit thereof. Lee Sharkey, a tender soul, opens with a cautionary poem, advising the reader that once living people are different from paper, and warns that the presence of absence is overwhelming. Still, for the poet and for us, absence is not all that's found. Lee's words are seeds planted for the children. This manual for the living is also testament to those whose deaths were too often unnatural. The poem, Something We Might Give, in conversation with Sutzkever, assures us that total erasure is impossible, that a wildflower returns to bloom in the ghetto, something nests in the chimney, we empty and fill, borrow books from the unliving, for there remained amid the losses this one thing, language. Lee's last lines of this final poem invite us to ever begin. Among the slaughtered sounds and newborn silence, Genesis words to light the long slumber. And now to Mark Melnicove.
Thank you, Anna. That was a perceptive presentation and sharing of Lee's poems. That was beautiful. Thank you. I first met Lee Sharkey. I'm going to talk about our personal and work relationship together. I first met her in May of 1978 at the College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor at the Maine Poets Festival, which was a wonderful gathering of the tribe that has not convened in this form for nearly 40 years. At that time, Lee was 33 and already the author of 3 books of poetry. She self-published all of these works in editions of a few hundred copies, printing them on antique letterpress equipment located in her barn in South Solon. For the festival, she was in charge of an ad hoc push-pinned on the wall exhibit in the college's dining room of letterpress printing by poets and small press operators, herself included, and also B. Gates. Being new to the state, I showed up unannounced and uninvited to the festival at age 26, introduced myself and asked Lee if I could hang up a few of my letterpress broadsides. And she said, sure, go ahead, her face open and smiling. She was warm and welcoming, and from the start, we discovered and were energized by our shared love of poetry, letterpress printing, progressive politics, and Maine. So we had a lot to talk about and do together. Over the next few years, we corresponded regularly, read our poems at subsequent festivals and other venues, and met at meetings of the Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance, which she and a dozen or so other publisher poets had founded in 1975. At the 1980 Maine Festival for the Arts at Bowdoin College, which was the Marshall Dodge Brainstorm, not to be confused with the Maine Poets Festival, I heard Lee read from her new manuscript at that time, Daughters Without Mothers, and was blown away by its intensity, musicality, and compassion. I had started my own small press, the Dog Ear Press, in 1979. So I asked her on the spot if I could publish her manuscript, and she said yes, without hesitation. We've been looking at the cover of that book, featuring a high contrast photo of Lee's mother. The book appeared in 1981, and inside are 17 poems illustrated by uncaptioned photographs from Lee's family album. Here, whoops. Here she is as a young girl with her grandmother. I just love the perspective in that photo. The poet Lee Sharkey in her first 3 books had come across as confessional, reporting out about her back to the land life and the people she was close to in South Solon, including her beloved and then preteen son, Jesse. She put aside those type of poems, however, in Daughters Without Mothers, focusing almost exclusively not on her life, but on the complex, often troubled lives and histories of other women. Before Daughters Without Mothers, Lee had published almost nothing about her Jewish heritage, but the last poem in the book broke new ground for her in that regard. Its subject matter was the women who had been coming to the Western Wall in Jerusalem for centuries to press their handwritten prayers into its cracks. As with most of the poems she was to write until her death in 2020, she gained traction and depth by integrating historical facts centered on Jewish themes with her wit and imagery. For instance, her 1995 book, To a Vanished World, a grouping of poems about Roman Vishniak's photographs of Eastern European Jews on the eve of the Holocaust. So here's the poem from Daughters Without Mothers about women praying at the Western Wall. I'm going to read it. It's 2 pages, but you can follow along. Just briefly note the spacing she employs and how this allows the poem to breathe and open up in surprising directions. Note the suspense created by her syntax. Note her observational eye, connected deeply and truly to her heart. Note her unapologetic embrace of a Jewish tradition that she enriched. It's numbered 17. It was the 17th book in this, 17th poem in the book. Oh, sorry. At the wall, women have gathered to mourn, a lamentation that opens at dawn on this spot and has continued for 19 centuries and more. Once a lament for the loss of the house on earth of Adonai, the unnameable. Now by slow and personal conversion, the one wall remaining, the repository here for grief and grievance. The drone of overture surrounds us. One woman is touching her mouth to the smooth, cool surface. Another has lifted the fringe of a shawl to her lips and 3-fingered presses it to stone. The grieving meet at the wall. Arise, son, speak to each other and rise as one. Language of origin. Before they leave, many tuck prayers on paper folded minute into the mortarless cracks between stones. Petitions I would like to read. I write one too. At night, will they be gathered? Lee was a rare talent, poet, publisher, editor, teacher, mother, spouse, friend, generous with her time and knowledge, someone who looked not at you, but into you when you conversed with her. She knew how to draw out your truth in poetry. What a subtle listener she was, a commensurate community builder. Over 45 plus years, she selflessly enriched the activist and poetry scenes in Maine. It's difficult to accept that she's gone because She still seems so present in my memories. And through her body of work, a beautiful, sincere mother lode that will endure. Okay, Anna.
Okay. I've put together a medley of poetic excerpts. So most of the pieces I'm reading are just short pieces from longer poems of Abraham Sutzkever's. And I want to create something of a biographic flow, understanding this is just the tip of the iceberg of Sutzkever's remarkable and very long life, I'm glad to say. I'll also be throwing in the occasional Yiddish, everything will be read in English, but I will be throwing in the occasional Yiddish line here and there to give the feeling of the language that the poet made his mission to keep alive. In September of 1941, the Vilna ghetto was created. There were always Nazis around, as you can see in the photo on the left, and some very crowded streets, at least at first. By the time the ghetto was created, a lot of Vilna Jews had already been mass murdered even by the time they created the ghetto. This is an excerpt from first night. Oh, I'd also like to take a look, if you can go to the next photo as well, Dina, right? This is on the right is Abraham Sutzkever, and on the left is his friend, a fellow poet named Kazarjinsky. Both of them were part of what was called Young Vilna, a group of young poets, of extraordinary young poets. Both of these men did survive, but most of the young Vilna poets did not and were killed by the Nazis. So this is from First Night in the Ghetto, Die erste Nacht in Ghetto. Die erste Nacht in Ghetto is die erste Nacht in Cave. The first night in the ghetto is the first night in the grave. Playful was the rain in the gutters, supple, soft, blessed. Mothers used to put out pails to catch sweet cloud milk and shampoo their daughters' hair. Now there are no mothers, no daughters, no rain. The ruins alone are my sister, the living stars of my town. And among them, the Sabbath star that mother lips used to bless, a happy new week. And live I must, for my mother's good star is alive. And next. This is a very youthful photograph of Sutzkever. And this is quite simply an excerpt from For My Mother, Für mein Mitte. In your stead, I find your torn nightshirt. I throw off my clothes and climb into your open naked shirt as into myself. It's no longer a shirt, but your bright skin. You speak to me straight, don't, my child. It's a sin, a sin. Accept our separation as just. If you remain alive, I will still be alive, as the pit of the plum contains in itself the tree, the nest and the bird, and all else besides. Next. On the left is a horrible place. It is a mass murder pit at a once beautiful park called Ponari. There was a World War I struck fortification built there that the Nazis reused as a mass murder pit. On the right, you see a very empty street in the Vilna ghetto, because by 1943, over 65,000 of its 75,000 residents had been murdered. And so the streets were depleted of people, and also those that were surviving were trying to hide. So the streets were quite empty. There's also references in this excerpt to the Nazi policy of mass theft, everything from plates and spoons to art and valuables and household items that were sent back to Germany. So this is from a poem called A Cartload of Shoes, a Wagen Schiech. Es klappen die Absassen, wohin, wohin, von alte Vilna Gassen, mir treibt uns kein Berlin. The wheels are turning, turning, what are they bringing there? From the old Vilna streets, they ship us to Berlin. And children's shoes everywhere. Why don't I see the child? Why are the bridal shoes not worn by the bride? and the heels are tapping, tapping. Where to, what in? From the old Vilnius streets, they chase us to Berlin. Next. This is, I'm going to intersperse a piece, some excerpts from a piece of my own. This is my father, Henry Chaim Wrobel. He was a Polish Jew in the Soviet army, as you can see in this vintage photograph of him in his Soviet uniform. The Russians called him Gennady Grigorovich, and I'd read he had a story of his own about a pile of shoes. So these are excerpts from Hearing Something New. We break for lunch. Not a meal goes by without surprise and revelation. He was there in the summer of '44 at the liberation of Majdanek, where 895,000 went to gas and dust. Nothing else ever happened there. He asked his captain about the mountains of tiny shoes next to hills of eyeglasses. The Russian officer replied, first tears in a year, Gennady, these are your Jewish children. Dad sips his tea, coughs from a bite of corn muffin, and wipes his eyes under a pair of spectacles that got away. Next. This is pregnancy and birth were outlawed by the Nazis. The order was given that all newborn babies in the hospital were to be poisoned as soon as they were born, and one of those babies was Abraham and Friedka Sutzkever's baby. So this is from the poem For My Child, for mein Kind. I wanted to swallow you, my child, when I felt your tiny body losing its heat in my fingers, as though I were pressing a warm glass of tea, feeling its passage to cold. Let the sun crumble like glass, since you never beheld its light. I wanted to swallow you, my child. Perhaps in my blood you will blossom as before, but I am not worthy to be your grave. So I bequeath you to the summoning snow, and you will bear greetings from me to the frozen grasslands ahead. Next. On the left, you see the bombed out ruins of YIVO, which was the Yiddish Institute that was an archive of Yiddish art, literature, songs, theater, plays, etc., that went back philosophy that went back hundreds of years. Before it was bombed, however, the Nazis ordered a group of poets and writers, amongst them Sutzkever, to choose the best of the archives to be sent to Frankfurt to a museum, and the rest was to be destroyed or sent to a factory to be recycled into paper and pulp. But instead, this group of poets and writers created something called the Paper Brigade. And what they did, instead of sending the best to Frankfurt, they actually smuggled the best of the archives to hiding places inside and outside the ghetto. And the picture on the right is after the Soviet liberation of Vilna, when a group of these poets and writers met together in Vilna to dig up these archives and sort through the paperwork. And I'd also, so if you could go to number 9, please, or the next one. I just want you to see the language. This is Sutzkever's handwriting in Yiddish, and this is a page of Yiddish text. The poem happens to be called Take Up Arms, Animtum den Adam Eisen. So this is from a poem called Grains of Wheat. Perhaps in destiny's hour, even these words may suddenly grow into flower. And like the prehistoric seed transformed into sheaves of wheat, these words will belong to my people, the eternal throng. Next. There was an enormous commitment to cultural resistance as well as to armed resistance. And all through the ghetto, there were symphonies and theaters, and there were poetry readings, and all levels of education were also established, and all had to be hidden from the Nazis because all of this activity was illegal. On the left, you see children in an orphanage. Most of their parents had been killed, listening to a teacher. And on the right was this marvelous, marvelous teacher named Myra that Sutzkever and his wife eventually named one of their daughters after in years later. So this is called The Teacher Myra, Die Lehrerin Myra. Azoi wie de Sonne, die Lehrerin Myra, a Kind offer eurem, a gildene Lyra. Like the very sun is the teacher Myra, a child in her arms like a golden lyre. She counts her treasure, 130 little heads. Oh, much better not to count. A holiday comes and there are no more than 40. And at dawn of the 130, Myra turned to flower and the little ones to bees. Grayed has the flower, wilted her core, but tomorrow in the dew, she will blossom once more. Next. With so many people gone, by the time that the ghetto had basically been depleted down to 10 or 15,000 people, many of the young survivors decided to take up arms. They were planning on this all along. They'd been smuggling arms in since the very beginning of the ghetto. And they fought in both the Vilna ghetto uprising and also when the liquidation of the ghetto came, those who survived the uprising went into the woods to join combat veterans, combat partisans, both Jewish and Russian. And this is the heart's voice. A Stimme von Harz. A Stimme von Harz befällt mir. The heart's voice commands. Believe in the desecrated word of justice. The distant heir of the lion must rebel against slavery. Destination, the wild primeval forest of memory. And if you seek a reason for anguish, transform yourself into its revelation and hear how grandfathers waken their sons. Next. This is a photograph of a group of partisans, men and women. This is Song at the Departure to the Forest, Lied beim Weggehen in Wald. This is a poem that very much places their generation in the larger, longer stream of Jewish history. Wachsereuser Helden, feste eingesparte Jungen. Spring forth, you heroes, stubborn, strong, stubborn lads. Sprout forth, you future sons. The glory of the Maccabees suddenly shone within you as it did 2,000 years before. Let our honor shine again in the fencing sword. Next. This is my mother, Etta Hayat Wrobel. This is the cover of a book that she wrote. She was a saboteur, a Gestapo prisoner, tortured, a rescue partisan in the woods of central Poland, and the lone survivor of a family of 12. I'm going to read some excerpts from a poem that I wrote about her called Equipment. What in her life equipped her? For smuggling the few guns a farmer may be bought for, hoping SS or Home Guard hadn't gotten to him first. What in her life equipped her? To see a pregnant sister butchered, ghetto burning, brothers shot running, father gone to forgotten grave in a hole somewhere in the surrounding woods. What in her life equipped her? To walk alone through this life, always dancing for the dozen, seeing traces of eyes and hands in children she dared to deliver from the fires and the pits. And next. At some point, Sutzkever became very much he was known in the Soviet Union as a poet of the partisans. His work had gotten to Moscow. And on the basis of that, by Stalin's order, Sutzkever and his wife were basically rescued in 1944 and brought from the woods to Moscow because they wanted Sutzkever to write the report of what the Nazis had done in Vilna as part of a series of testimonies known as the Black Book. This was to be a series of witness for the obviously upcoming war crimes trials. And on the right, you see that in 1946, Sutzkever was assigned to the Nuremberg trials. He wanted to give his testimony in Yiddish, but at the trials, they said that they could not translate that. And since Russian was one of the official languages, he had to give his testimony in Russian. On the left, you see Sutzkever standing, and he's with a group of very famous Soviet Jewish writers and poets. Many of the people in the group that you see here were later murdered by Stalin between 1948 and 1952, what became Night of the Murdered Poets. However, Sutzkever had a real sense of the danger. And in 1947, he went back to Poland, and then he went to Paris, and then he ended up in Tel Aviv. So this is from, sorry, there's some noise out there. This is an excerpt from a poem, To the Vein in My Head. However great my generation, its smallness is greater yet. Only the word endures, homely as it is and yet resonant. To the thin vein in my head, I entrust the last loveliness, a wind, grass, the night's concluding star. Next. This is a delightful photograph of Sutzkever and his wife Friedka. In Moscow, they had another child in 1945, named after his mother, Raina. And this is an excerpt from I'm Thankful We're Both Alive at the Same Time. I'm thankful we're both alive at the same time. Thankful we're both alive on the same earth. I'm thankful we're both alive in the same life. Thankful we're both alive in the same death. And next. This is Sutzkever standing next to a Polish woman, Janova, who hid him for some months while he was very much wounded. Her family did this at great risk. They also smuggled food into the ghetto. And eventually he snuck back into the ghetto because he didn't want to endanger them anymore. And he also wanted to seek out loved ones. But years later, when he learned about her death, he wrote, on the death of Janova Bartoszewicz, who rescued me. And I will just read a couple of excerpts from that. Had it not been for you who saved me, I would have had to sever my life, knotted with other lives, and my sleeping, comforting daughter would never have asked her marvelous question, Daddy, how old was I really before I was born? It is raining now. Look, here comes a cloud, a cellar within it, and you in a kerchief like a meadow among the gallows, bent over me, mound of wounds that I was. Dear Janova, though you have been rained out today in Jerusalem, a rainbow breaks through, glistens in your memory. And next. This is from a poem written 50 years after his liberation. Letters without addresses. I write my letters without addresses to those who live under wither, under flower. They answer too, their handwriting familiar to me. Those who have gone now want to make me happy, and I am drawn there to those to whom I write my letters without addresses, to thank them for so long not forgetting. And last, the last picture, the last poem. This is my maternal grandparents. This is Scheindel and Pincus Hyatt. My sister is named for our grandmother, Scheindel. Few of the second generation had grandparents and elders, and in our family, we had none. Yet their transmitted memory played a very, very significant role in our lives. And so this is a poem that I've written for my maternal grandmother, Scheindel, who was killed at Treblinka death camp with her youngest few children. Scheindel. How do you miss someone you don't know? How do you know what you're missing? I have seen your protection, been clothed in your breathing, our children you carried through dark and rough seas, the shattering of glass, the felling of trees. How rude of me to feign strangeness, how false to speak of missing, when you've only just been away. Thank you. And now to Mark.
Thank you, Anna. I'm going to talk about what I've called Sutzkever's visions of God's nature. This is a photograph of Sutzkever amid the ruins of the Vilnius synagogue courtyard, the Schulhof, summer 1944, after the liberation of Vilna. They came back to assess what had happened and saw some horrific things. So from the beginning of my study of Sutzkever's work, I've been fascinated and instructed by his ever-changing relationship with God as expressed in his poems. He found his way to God through nature and human nature all mixed together. And he went to the brink and back to do that. One of his translators, Benjamin Harshav, who knew Sutzkever well, wrote, "He truly believed that only through poetry would he survive the Holocaust. Hence, it had to be a different kind of poetry, endowed with magical power to change reality. A poetry, as he often wrote, that both God and the dead would like to read." In this same essay, Harshav referred to Sutzkever's attraction to a non-normative, self-centered religiosity. Unpack that a bit. By non-normative, he meant something different from the established norms of a lawgiver, patriarchal Lord dwelling in the heavens, omnisciently separate from human conflicts. A Lord who can be questioned, yes, and prodded, yes, but ultimately whose authority must be submitted to. However, Sutzkever's God was down-to-earth God, not a disembodied presence, but one with human emotions like us, a work in progress. In Sutzkever's cosmology, the divine and the world are aspects of a single evolving whole. As he wrote in one of the poems you'll hear, "A Face in the Window," both God and humans weep over loss. Both God and humans are and aren't separate entities. So here's a medley of poems. First one, Pray, written in Vilna and hiding in 1942. And he started to date his poems when he was in the ghetto, and practice he continued throughout the rest of his life. So this was translated by C.K. Williams in the 1980s. Pray. I think I just thought of a prayer, but I can't imagine who might be there. Sealed in a steel womb, how can I pray? To whom? Star, you were once my dear friend. Come, stand for the words that have come to an end. But dear Death Star, I understand you're too far. Still, someone in me insists, pray, tormenting me in my soul. Pray, prayer, oh, wildest surmise, I still babble you till sunrise. I'm skipping around chronologically a little bit. Now he's in Israel. It's 1956. This was translated by Hannah Block. It's entitled, quite simply, Toys. My daughter, you must care for your toys. Poor things. They're even smaller than you. Every night when the fire goes to sleep, cover them with the stars of the tree. Let the golden pony graze the cloudy sweetness of the field, lace up the little boy's boots when the sea eagle blows cold. Tie a straw hat on your doll and pull a bell in her hand. For not one of them has a mother, and so they cry out to God. Love them, your little princesses. I remember a cursed night when there were dolls left in all 7 streets of the city, and not one child. It was also written in Israel. This is published in 1985 in his book, Poems from My Diary, translated by Maya Evrona. Certainly this poem sprang out of his experiences in the forest as a resistance fighter. Those green eyes from long, long, long ago. Those green eyes from long, long, long ago are gone. That fir tree, forest green, still, as I do just barely see the eyes, it's a sign. They see me. And fir branch green is also my envy of starved ghosts, of sounds and of voices. If God would only recreate their green, that dark green, he would truly be God. How could they vanish? I'm wandering in a forest. The sun burns through a cobweb. Green tears rush from green caves among roots. If that green set of eyes would shut for all time, worm-eaten seconds would take the place of eternity. I wander in a forest. It is night. A root pulses, still believing, after all, the sun through the cobweb here has not gone away. They see me, that dark green. They wait for a sign. They shiver side by side with their face opposite mine. And from the green caves, rushing tears swim into my visions and leave me their shine. Sorry, I'm having trouble with these keys. They're sticking on my computer. Do we see this picture? Yeah. So here they are sorting through manuscripts after the liberation of Vilna, partisan headquarters. Okay, A Face in the Window, also written in Israel and published in 1985, translated by Maya Evrona. His poems after the war got much more reflective about his relationship with God. The first one I read, pray. As you can see, he doesn't even know where God is or how to pray. And so as he got older, he turned more and more to metaphysics and philosophy. He lived on the 6th floor of an apartment in Tel Aviv at the time. A face in the window, a face in the window. It's my neighbor with the blue glasses, resembling flashes of blue lightning and rain. Take pity and come quickly to my doorstep. You will hear a mystery of weeping and perhaps be able to explain it for me. We come to his doorstep. My neighbor in the blue glasses rises on his toes to reach the mezuzah and bring it to his ear as if it were the fiddler in a seashell. Is my creator weeping there? My child or my wife who was burned to ashes? The door is open. Yortzeit candles with red payas are burning. I become a brother to my neighbor's fate, and my ear detects more clearly, like him, the weeping from his mezuzah, weeping from his wife of ashes, his child, or his creator. The Yortzeit candles with red payas are drowning in the room. The door slams behind us. Outside plays the fiddler. I will tell you the truth, as good neighbors do. The weeping comes from all three separately, all three of them together. I guess I tend to favor these poems written in Israel, published in 1985. This is translated by Richard J. Fine. As we seen earlier, he's not a poet afraid of repetition in his poetry. Who will last? What will last? A wind will last. The blind will die, their blindness last. The ocean's raveled foam will last. A cloud snagged by a tree will last. Who will last? What will last? A syllable will last as creation seeds again and lasts. For its own sake, a fiddle rose will last. 7 blades of grass that know the rose will last. Longer than all, the northern stars will last. The star that falls in a tear will last. In the jug, a drop of wine will last. Who will last? What will last? God will last. Isn't that enough for you? Again, a 1985 poem, this one translated by Benjamin and Barbara Harshav. This is his answer to non-believers. You say there is no God, no world creator. If so, my friend, it seems the miracle is greater. He isn't and created all that isn't, all that is, light and shade, rainbows of madness, all are his. Created life, created death in an eternal dance where only once we come to taste his healing herbs. Created pearls of sound in the seashell of remembrance and little changing clouds the universe disturbs. You say, you have to take fate in your own hand. Oh, I do not disagree with you, my friend, but where do you take it? Tell it to my pack of fingers. Easier to take the Eiffel Tower on your back. Your shadow must have gulped a bucket full of cheer, but I'll confide a secret into his swinging ear. Only an ant can carry on its back alone its fate. It may take us ages to rise up to its state. This is the last one of his I'll read, and then I'm going to read a poem of mine in response. A prayer, written in Israel in 1978, translated by Benjamin and Barbara Harshaw. A prayer. For years, a prayer sails in my veins, and its waves my strophes bend. Dear God, let us exchange our memories. I will recall the beginning. You will remember the end. This is my poem now, written during my study of Sutzkever. It's 100 seconds to midnight, and pieces of Sutzkever are falling as snow, splinters of infinity, screaming fishes, bodies that can't free themselves from history, extinguished stars in water, the abyss of cold mirrors, pieces of Sutzkever from on high, land in palms. Notes from his father's fiddle rows, Yiddish vowels, stormtroopers don't understand, grass where ash used to grow. Remember? Soot from the hole inside his mother's chimney, where he hid from eyeballs sniffing flesh. Wind buttoning day with night. Pieces of firmaments, clouds snagged by trees in unspeakable aftermaths, burning Torah scrolls, Ada noise, outtakes, pieces of Sutzkever falling as snow, blooming in earth dark. Blooming in earth dark. Blooming. Okay, that ends this portion of the evening's presentation. Now we're going to open it up for questions and answers. We'd love to hear from you if you have some thoughts or comments or just want to ask for some clarification or anything else. Anna and I will do our best to answer.
If you have questions, please submit them in the chat and we will read them aloud.
I don't have a question, just a comment. This was a beautiful, beautiful program. Thank you for your compassion, the beauty of your words, and educating us about other aspects of the Shoah.
I'd like to start with a question, and Anna and Mark, you can both, or whoever feels like responding to this. Obviously, there were, first of all, this was incredibly moving and beautiful, to reiterate the comment that was just made, and clearly, Sutzkever is an exceptional and unique human being. I'm wondering, of the pantheon of Shoah poets and artists, what about him resonated or spoke to each of you personally that caused you to immerse yourselves in his work and to respond to his work?
I'll go first, and I'm sure Mark has something to say about this as well. Full disclosure, I mean, I'd certainly heard of Sutzkever. I had read some of his work in anthologies, but I had really never dug down deep until almost 2 years ago. The Maine Jewish Film Festival was showing the documentary Black Honey that was made by his granddaughter. And we were supposed to run a panel where Lee Sharkey was to be the expert on the panel about Sutzkever, and I was to provide some background on the Holocaust, and Mark was going to, we were all going to be part of this. And then of course, the virus came, we shut that down, it never happened, and unfortunately, in the years after that, she died. When this came as an opportunity to dedicate this to Lee and then kind of run our own program, I had to immerse in Sutzkever, and I found a teacher. Straight up, I found a mentor. I'm not done. I'm totally in the middle of this exploration and discovery. I am no expert on Sutzkever, as was Lee. I just keep going deeper and deeper. I am not done after tonight, not by any stretch. His ability to capture history into poetic forms and to transmit it is something that has always been what I have sought to do. I mean, some of you here have seen my history/poetry presentations, and it's always what I have sought to do, especially around this enormous subject. And he just resonates so much. I'm involved. As I said, it's just the tip of the iceberg. I'm deep into his world, his life, his work. And I can see that I basically want to possess every poem he ever wrote, every piece of prose he ever wrote. I'm in the middle of reading the report that he gave to Moscow at this point, and it's all done in prose. They told him no poetry, just make this journalistic. Even as a journalistic writer, he is amazing, and I've just been so inspired by him, and I can't believe that I had not explored him further in the past. And I was looking for, again, this whole thing about the connection also to history, taking people who are, the lack of presence, but the connection to the stream of history has always been something that has been important to me. And I basically found a teacher. That's what it is for me. And I'm sure Mark has his reasons.
I could reiterate what you said, but I'll add this. Today, I was listening to a podcast with Joy Harjo, Poet Laureate of the United States of the Muskogee Creek tribe. And her new memoir is called Poet Warrior. And she was talking about how she's a poet warrior, and Sutzkever was a poet warrior. And he was the least likely, according to his contemporaries, based on the kind of person he was before the war, romantic, maybe head in the clouds or in books. They called him Ariel, to resist so successfully and so persistently. And he was a poet warrior. And the interviewer asked Joy Harjo, is it possible to, be a poet without being a warrior? And she said, I don't think so. So, the other thing about Sutzkever is his technique is impeccable. I'm not fluent in Yiddish. I can see what he does though, because I know the letters, I can sound it out, and his use of rhyme and meter, it's hard to translate that into the English, but that's an aspect of his poetry that's like, I admire that a lot.
And I also say, just speaking about the warrior aspect, Sutzkever was as strongly committed to the idea of cultural resistance as he was to the idea of the eventual armed resistance that would take place. There were arguments in the ghetto. Do we risk doing cultural things when we're not supposed to? He was adamant. He was one of those leaders of the cultural movements in the ghetto, saying, absolutely, we have to have poetry readings, we have to have children's plays, we have to have music, the symphony, most of whom was murdered. We have to have concerts. We have to do all this because people are dying every day. But those of us that are still alive cannot walk around like the living dead. We have to have life in us. And this was extremely important to him, even at the risk of the Nazis finding out that all of these events were taking place in hiding. He was one of those who insisted that no, the debate in the ghetto was, do we take the chance? Or is this the right time to have a play when so many people are dying? Is this the right time to be fooling around? And he said, this is not fooling around. This is absolutely what we need to do, because people who are still alive must feel alive. That was extremely important to him. And that's, and my parents were like that, so that's another place where he resonates so strongly for me. And when you say really unlikely, I read that piece, the excerpts about my mother. She was the valedictorian of her gymnasium. She was, her dream was to go to the university, go to university. The last thing she expected in her life was to be, a partisan in the woods or be tortured by the Gestapo in the Lublin Castle prison. I mean, these were the last things she ever expected to have to do, again, there were some, one of the things as I'm reading in Sutzkever's testimony for the Black Book for Moscow is how many women, I knew, of course, that there were many, many women in the resistance, but his really specific description of what they were doing, the amazing, amazing things that the women partisans were also doing is remarkable. At some point, I wouldn't mind doing a program about what he describes about these remarkable, remarkable women. But he also thought it was really important that the teacher Myra, to him, was just as important. She, of course, was killed. But what she was doing with the children, in his view, was just as important as taking up arms. Absolutely. Dressing up the kids for holidays, even though last night 40 had disappeared. She believed it was absolutely essential to keep people feeling alive. And that is something, my sister is out here in this audience somewhere, and that is something that anybody in my family can testify to, which is that you're alive, you have to feel alive. And that's another place where he totally inspires me, totally.
Thank you both so much. I want to share that we've had comments in the chat that people are so grateful for this program, that it is moving, painful, enlightening, inspiring. We have some questions that have come in. Amy asks, I want to know more about the Paper Brigade. When was this archive discovered? Is this archive similar to the Ringelblum archive?
This is a good question coming from Amy, who actually, Amy McDonald, who's an educator and a dear friend of mine in Birmingham, Alabama, and has written a book, Word Smugglers, which is a kind of extraction of the Ringelblum archives and to make them suitable for schools, for middle school and high school students, and I suppose even into college as well. They're similar only in the sense that they were hidden. Okay, that's the sense that they're similar. What these the Ringelblum archives are like the immediate diaristic entries of those in the Warsaw Ghetto. Whereas YIVO was an institution that archived hundreds of years of Yiddish writings, songs, plays, artwork, etc. So that in that sense, it was not an immediate, matter of fact, the Black Book is really more like the Ringelblum archives in that they're very much more diaristic in that sense, or journalistic. But YIVO eventually, what was saved of the archives eventually ended up in Moscow. But in the post-war period, as Stalin started to turn on the Jewish anti-fascist writers, Sutzkever and others of those in the paper brigade started to be worried that maybe Stalin would not allow this archives to really exist. And they ended up smuggling them again, only this time, while there was some possibility, they sent them all to New York City. And New York City is where YIVO is, on 16th Street in Greenwich Village. And that's where it was moved to in the post-war period. It's a marvelous place. And basically New York became the center of Yiddish culture and life. When Sutzkever went to Israel, there were people who said to him in the early decades, everybody here wants you to speak Hebrew. They don't want you to speak that ghetto language. It was actually Yiddish hostile, and for a couple of decades. And they said, you'd be better off in New York. You'd be better off in New York, where Yiddish culture it exists now. And but again, his defiance was, no, this language belongs here. It will take a while, but eventually, when people feel secure enough in their Hebrew, right, and a generation later will discover this. And what's marvelous is that there are Hebrew campfire songs based on Sutzkever translations of Sutzkever poetry that they didn't even know were written in Yiddish by Sutzkever, right? And so it took a while before the language became an acceptable thing to explore once a generation passed and had the confidence in their rootedness in Hebrew. But again, it was part of his resistance and defiance, which is, no, I'm not going to go to New York, where, of course, he went to New York to visit and lecture. But he said, no, I'm not going to live in New York where it's easy to do Yiddish culture. I'm going to stay here because this is the place where it also has to be rooted. So in that sense, YIVO is quite different than the Ringelblum diaries, in that it's basically, it's vast, it's hundreds of years. A lot of it was destroyed. A lot of it, they chose the best stuff to hide, and the Nazis sent off just tons and tons of material to paper recycling factories, basically destroyed as a Yiddish archive. And, but what was saved was, in the view of the paper brigade, the best, most valuable stuff. So in that sense, it's hundreds of years of work that was saved.
We have some more questions, and I just wanted to let our audience know that Anna and Mark have graciously agreed to stay on a bit after our end time. So we will continue to take some questions, and this event is being recorded. So if you do need to leave, we will have a recording available later that we can put out. The next question comes from Michael, and he asks, have you noticed any of Abraham Sutzkever's influence on poets that came after him?
It's an odd question because I mean, he's kind of considered in a way the last of the Yiddish poets. I mean, the original Yiddish poets, and I don't know what poetry is being written in Yiddish these days. As far as influence from the translations around the world, yeah, I mean, you're with two poets tonight who were influenced by him, but I can't really say with certainty that in any significant way, like some of the Polish poets of the same era, like Miłosz and Zbigniew Erberts and Szymborska, two of the three I mentioned got the Nobel Prize in Literature. Sutzkever did not. There's a way in which the world of poetry, I have to choose my words carefully here, was not as interested in him because, I don't know. Anna, maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Well, I would agree with you. I mean, he, even from Tel Aviv, he established the most influential Yiddish journal in the world called The Golden Chain. And he took Yiddish writings, prose and poetry, the best in the world. I mean, even in New York, they acknowledged that the Golden Chain Journal was the best Yiddish journal in the world, but what does that mean, in terms of how many Yiddish journals there were? I think we may see some, as we see the Yiddish language become more and more significant. I think that was, would have been a tremendous surprise to him to see sort of a rebirth of interest in Yiddish, and not just amongst the Orthodox who use Yiddish as a daily language and Hebrew as a religious language. We may yet see more Yiddish poetry being written as you see more and more universities and the influence of YIVO in New York City. It's hard to say. I do know you had a translation, Mark, by Richard Fine. Richard Fine still writes poetry in Yiddish himself. He's not just a translator. I don't know to what degree he has personally been influenced by Sutzkever, but he's still.
And Maya Evrona, another one of the translators, she writes poetry. She doesn't have a book out yet. The Harshavs, well, I'm not sure about Barbara, but Benjamin, he was a poet as well.
Writing in Yiddish?
C.K. Williams, the first poet that wrote the poem Pray, in the pantheon of American poets of the 20th century, obviously was influenced by Sutzkever. So,
so I'm not sure, so I can't, as I say, I'm just really immersing myself now. I don't know if I'll end up, I've helped my mother translate her poetry from Yiddish to English, but with a great deal of help from her as well. But I don't know, a lot of the Yiddish poetry is in the past, but we'll see. We'll see what happens down the line. I think he's so unique, though, that, as I said, I've read some of Richard Fine's work. It doesn't sound like Sutzkever to me. It doesn't sound like that. His work is incredibly unique in so many ways. But let's see what happens with the next generation. If there's more Yiddish poetry on the horizon.
We have several more questions to get through. Beatrix asks, first of all, she says, thank you for the whole program, beginning with Lee's gifts. She asks a couple of questions. Did Lee translate any of Sutzkever, although she clearly responded to him across and inside time? Also, has Hannah Block translated a book of Sutzkever's?
Thanks, B, for those questions. B, I mentioned B, in case you missed it when I was mentioning meeting Lee for the first time, because B was there too. She was exhibiting at the Maine Poets Festival. So I don't know that Lee translated Sutzkever. I haven't heard of anything. And as far as Hannah Block goes, I know she published at least one other book of Yiddish poetry, but the selections of Sutzkever she did, I think, were done for anthologies and maybe in magazines. I got that poem out of this book, the Penguin Book of Modern Yiddish Verse, published in 1989. It has Yiddish on one side and the English translation on the other. It's a terrific compilation of not just Sutzkever's poetry. He actually ends the book, but of others of his generation and the generation before. One of the ironies of all of this is that Yiddish, the birth of Yiddish literature in the 20th century was immense. It was powerful. It was, there were a bunch of Yiddish writers who could go toe-to-toe with anyone in the world writing at that time. And so there was this flowering, especially between World War I and World War II, and then wham,
Well, Isaac Bashevis Singer won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and it's the first time anyone who wrote in, largely in Yiddish won the Nobel Prize for Literature. So yes, there was, Sholem Aleichem, Yud Lamed Peretz. I mean, there were a lot of very great Yiddish writers, and of course, once again, that YIVO archive had all of this work in their libraries. But I've also entertained. This isn't answering that question, but I've also entertained the possibility. It's just the possibility. It's something I'd like to look into. Is that once it became okay in Israel to explore Yiddish, that I wonder if that didn't open the door also to the other Jewish languages like Ladino and Judeo-Arabic. And also, even though Farsi is not a Jewish language, but many Iranian Jews who still spoke Farsi, even in Israel, even their children, being raised in households that still spoke Farsi. And we've seen just sort of an explosion, especially in the music scene. But we've really seen an explosion of Ladino, Judeo-Arabic, Farsi, song, poetry, literature in Israel, and all other cultural trappings as well. And I just have a little suspicion that once the door to Yiddish opened up, it just opened up the door to like every Jewish language that has, emerged through the diasporic history, through the history of exile and diaspora. And because now in Israel, it's kind of like this, all of these are in the culture. And I think that's wonderful because again, there's no lack of confidence in the rootedness of modern Hebrew as there would have been in those in the first years. So that's just a pet thesis of mine. And I intend to see if I can find out if there's any truth to that.
That's very interesting. And there's certainly been a proliferation of Mizrahi and Sephardic culture, music, language, proliferation and a legitimization and an acceptance in Israel. It's always been there, but it's much more, it's been mainstreamed now in a way that it was marginalized previously. Beatrix also asks, where can we read his descriptions of the women in the forest, in diaries, testimonies?
Well, there is actually, Mark mentioned this book. I'll hold it up. It's like an interlibrary loan. This has just been published in 2021. This is Sutzkever's memoir and testimony from the Vilna ghetto to Nuremberg. It's been translated by Justin Cammy, C-A-M-M-Y, but Cammy also put in an extraordinary afterword, right? That's over 100 pages long, but this is a book that it's going to go back to interlibrary loan, but I intend to purchase it and have it because there's the section on the partisans just has so many descriptions of at least the women that he knew personally. And I highly recommend this book. It's, it's interesting that Justin Cammy said that he put he said he made an afterword. He said, if you want, read the afterword first, or if you're the kind of person who doesn't do that, read it later. I read it first because it sets the historical context and the explanation of even the limits that Sutzkever worked under in having to write this for Stalin. Even the limits of what he discovered in terms of like what was appropriate expression under the Soviet system in terms of the things. It's still remarkably candid. But I would say that this testimony is where he has a great deal of detail in the section on the partisans about the women. He makes a point of talking about the women. Abba Kovna's wife, Vitna Kempner, goodness gracious, some of the things that she did, the chances they took. I know the chances my mother took, but this is just more of that, just, the incredible. And many of them were killed in action. Others survived, but they took, they never stopped, sort of like the female of the species, as they say, can be more ferocious than the male of the species when your children are, when your whole society and children are in danger. And he really writes lovingly and just, about them. So I would suggest, it's just been translated into English. So this, I think, is, and I think YIVO, as Mark said, YIVO had this today at noon. They had Justin Cammy speaking about this today, but there's a lot in there about the women, a lot. And there's other things as well. Judy Battalion's book, which was mentioned in the chat, but in terms of his testimony, this is a great place to look for it. It's just called From the Vilna Ghetto to Nuremberg, translated and edited by Justin Cammy. Highly recommend.
Thank you, Anna. And Judy Battalion's book, The Light of Days, tells the story of women in the ghettos. We co-presented that author talk as part of our Arts and Culture series a couple of months ago. The female of the species should never be underestimated.
God, no.
Shane, Anna's sister, says she loves listening to her sister present. He says, though she is the older sister, you, Anna, are her inspiration and hero. So any final thoughts or comments, Anna, Mark, before we wrap up this evening?
Well, thank you, Dina, for hosting us this evening, and to the JCA, and Anna, always to you. Your poetry and your life, your parents' life, grandparents, remains an inspiration. Anna and I kind of had two different kind of Jewish lives growing up. She was very immersed in the Holocaust, being a child of survivors. For me, I knew that the Holocaust existed, but I had no idea that 50 of my relatives perished in it until I did some genealogical research about 20, 30 years ago, because like many American households, no one ever talked about it. No one ever talked about the personal connection to it. I'm sure that, you know, Anna knows this, so it's like, but it's like, and so here we've come together tonight from different backgrounds and join in our study and really honoring those who came before us. So thanks everyone for coming. Peace.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you, Anna. To just respond to a last comment from Joanna about how to bring this into schools where these topics are not necessarily getting the attention that they need, I would say, please write to your administrators, connect with the history and social studies teachers in the schools, and highlight these topics, these authors, these books, bring them to their attention. It's certainly something that we at the JCA do. We bring school groups into the J to do Holocaust education, and it's obviously really important to get this out to the broader public. Anna, go ahead, please.
I just want to also mention HHRC, Holocaust and Human Rights Center at the University of Maine, Augusta. They have teachers all over the state who travel to different schools and do different programs on Holocaust studies, genocide studies, civil rights work as well. So they are also a good resource for getting things into the school. Can I just have your indulgence, because I'd like to end with a poem that I dedicated to Mark Melnicove, if that would be all right, in my second collection. And it's just a wish for all of us anyway, okay? And the reason I dedicated it to Mark is because one time at a reading, he heard it and he told me that he really loved it. So when I published, I dedicated it to him. I thought that was a great reason to dedicate it to him. So he loved it. So, and he asked me for a copy. It's anybody who asks me for a copy, you're getting a dedication. Anyway, so this is called Days of Jubilee of the Early Hebrew Commonwealth. In the days of Jubilee, it was a mother's world, a father's peace, a child's play. In the days of Jubilee, we each one had a place, a shared space, a common grace. In the days of Jubilee, there was no taking, only using, only caring for the source of all our tables. In the morning, we'd awaken, women and men, each in their own skin, as friends wandering, creations trailing like ducks crossing. In the evening, we would listen to songs of genius wrapped up in books. It's good to be warm with water boiling and tea scent rising. In the days of Jubilee, it was a mother's world, a father's peace, a child's play. And it's been such a pleasure working with Mark again, because we were colleagues, teaching colleagues. It's such a pleasure working with Dina. And I just appreciate all of you being here. And there's my daughter.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you so much, Mark. This was a beautiful, painful, moving, inspiring commemoration of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and a beautiful, beautiful testament to Lee Sharkey's memory. Thank you all for joining us this evening.
And thank you, Dina.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Mark.